Okay, so we're in part 3 of this adaptation to target the connective tissue and the myofascial concept and the fluid movement. I'm going to take my mask off here so that I look nice on camera. I gave you all 2 pieces of paper towel. Luke, give me that client that I damaged.
Oh, yeah. No, that's real recycling right there.
Now, one of the palpation senses that you really need to develop with this is bind, ease and bind, or end feel. Now, this is in your textbooks, both for the entry-level program and for the advanced program. But it's a skill, this idea of where is that first sensation of stop. Ryan, the Cro-Magnon man, just walked through. Okay. All right. So, I'm going to demonstrate this, and then I'm going to talk you through it. And so you're going to hold the paper towel with one hand here and one hand on the other side. So the perforations are in the middle, okay? When you do this, one hand is static, or forearm. You could do this with forearm too. I mean, you can do this with your feet. Doesn't matter what you do it with as long as it binds, right? Okay, so we're going to use our hand for the sensation. And then the other hand is going to move. So for this, our left hand is going to be still and stabilize, and our right hand is going to move. So if I have if I have slop in the middle of that, and I don't necessarily feel a tug anywhere, that's ease. Got it? Got that sense? And then if I start to elongate, bring these edges apart, pay attention to your still hand, not your moving hand. Close your eyes and start to bring that apart until you just feel it tug in your still hand. Just that initial tug, don't go beyond that. And then bring it back to ease. And then again, move your right hand, elongate, separate. Really pay attention to your still hand. Soon as I feel it in my still hand tugging just a little bit, I have reached bind. Now you'll have to have your eyes open for that. If I start to do that same move, and I start at ease, and I start to bring that out so that it's bind, this is where I start to feel it in my still hand, and I look at the perforations, and I slowly increase that elongation, that separation, so that I start to see space between those perforations. You should feel like you've got to work at that a little bit. You got to really hold a little tighter, and you're pulling a little more. You can see the perforations through there. That's through bind. If I try to take that as far as I can, that was too much. All right? So what you want to do is practice to bind and through bind. Through bind is always going to require some effort. To bind, certainly you're moving, but it's not necessarily at an effort area. Okay, now, When you are assessing for connective tissue bind, what you are doing is moving an area of superficial tissue to bind. So bind, then I'm going to move it in another direction. Bind, and then I'm going to move it in another direction, like you're going around the clock. And the amount of give, the amount of slide that's available in that given area should be pretty much the same. Now you're going to have a little bit more excursion on the back than you will on the side of the leg. And it has to do with how the tissue is anchored. However, in any given area, that excursion should be about the same. If it's not, I might have a little bit of stickiness. The intervention would be, anybody want to guess? The intervention is, take it, I'm already at bind, because that's where I'm assessing at, or myofascial-ish type thing-ish stuff. I take it to bind and through bind. And I hold it. Now I like to layer forces on that. So this is gonna move the surface layer back and forth. But it's even gonna be better if I hold it at bind and have them move, right? So I might get to bind. I decide that there's a little stickiness there. So I'm gonna take it through bind, hold it, and I'm gonna have them move. Just a little bit. That's myofascial release. We're done now. Now, there's nuance around how do you find a particular, how do you adapt to doing that on the leg versus doing that on the thorax and some of that kind of stuff, but essentially that's it.
And you'll see that even with the implement assisted, the cupping, the tape. You take the tissue to bind and through bind, and then if you're going to get maximal benefit, you incorporate some movement. So cupping is a perfect example of that. Put the cup on the area, move the joint that's adjacent to it. And using her analogy for the visual learners, the idea of checking and assessing that the tissue moves evenly in each direction. The clock is a good example of, like, can you move it between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock? It should be even on those kinds of patterns. So plus signs and X's are your assessment. Everything should be able to move in pluses and X's. Where it's less is where you intervene, where there isn't as much.
This is called a direct method. Now that means that you're going into, like usually I'll call it a lesion, you're going into the dysfunction. There's another way to do this that's really successful. You ready for this? I move it around, I find my bind, did my assessment, I find where that's at, and instead of taking it into that bind and creating that elongation, I take it to ease. And have them move a little bit. And that is creating some slop in the superficial tissues, and then the movement underneath it. Now, a lot of people don't include the movement underneath, they just do these static holds. But I'm too lazy to do that. You know, I'm not gonna waste my time. I'm gonna bring multiple levels of forces. But if somebody doesn't want it, you know, you can do that. And then you just,
And time associated with benefit is the key component there. If they and you want more benefit for the time applied, then the movement should be incorporated. If they need to just lay there and be asleep, or they're already asleep, then you're stuck doing it passively, right?
yeah.
So that's how it goes.
So again, you gotta hold one spot down. You translate apart for your assessment to find that if you got an equal slide. You feel where that's at. This is the way Dr. Chadow would teach. I know the direction that I gotta go with that if I'm going into that to bind through bind. But instead of doing that right away, I would take that into ease, into bind, into ease, into bind, into ease, into bind.
Doesn't that kind of create a stretch, kind of like similar to like yoga concepts where you go into one position and come back up? And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
back
yeah.
up?
Certainly. And you'll see that with lots of stretching mobility stuff that you go into it, come back out, go back in. The benefit even here mechanically is that as she goes to ease, so show that when you do, that was definitely through bind.
Yes, relax.
But as she approximates the tissue together,
That's not a good way to maintain retention, clients. Okay.
but visualize, if you approximate that tissue together into ease, what's happening to the stuff? You're going to bubble it together, you're going to create some lift. See, when you approximate it together into ease, you kind of squish it all together, create a little bit of lift of maybe this tissue that's entrapped, and then you are slowly challenging it out of that phase into the tension. So you're creating more shape change of that superficial tissue for less effort. And even in the context of the intensity of the sensation, this is not as intense. If you just go into bind, or as you saw, through bind, it has a more intense, even burny kind of sensation.
Yeah, and that's when you're working at bind, one of the things you'll know that you're in at the right intensity is it'll feel pulley.
Stretchy, burny.
Yeah, and okay. Now,
But she talked about the shear forces. So that whole idea, moving it toward the spot, and even kind of just those dial hands, the clock idea is a good one, that where the hands of the clock are, you know, pull those towards center and then move apart. Okay. Oh. Arts and crafts at its best.
now we're going to do a piece of lymphatic drain. Woo! All right. So, you see that fold right there? That's a lymphatic capillary. See that fold right there? Right here. All right? And a collector, a lymphatic collector, it's a really little tube that's open-ended, like roots on a plant. And it's attached to the underneath deep fascia a little bit, and then it's also got a little fiber connection up on the top. So it'd be the underside of the superficial fascia. And the fluid is all around. This is interstitial, it's tissue fluid, it's everywhere. And the job of the lymphatic system is to suck that up into the lymphatic tubes. Then it actually becomes lymph. And then it goes through a series of filtering processes, and then that fluid's dumped back into the bloodstream.
Perfect analogy is all the drains and receptacles on the sides of roads to collect water into tubes and then take it to a plant to be processed and purified.
Now, there is a little bit of a direction in this once it gets in the tube. Once it gets in the tube. So this tissue fluid actually comes from the bloodstream. It's the capillary interface between the arterial blood and the venous blood. Fluid seeps out. Now when it's in the blood tubes, it's called plasma, which is water with some proteins and stuff in it. And then when it seeps out during exchange of nutrient and oxygen and all that kind of stuff, and it's in the spaces around the cells, now it's interstitial fluid. Then when that same fluid is sucked up from around the cells, then it is lymph. Then it is purified through lymph nodes and other lymph tissue, and it dumps back into the venous system, which then goes right back into the blood tubes, and now it's plasma again. So, but while it is in the interstitial space, think of the cells like goldfish in a goldfish bowl. And they're surrounded in water, right? Well, where does fish poop go? It goes in the surrounding water, right? Or fish pee or fish sweat or whatever. Do fish sweat? All right? So if you've got a fish tank, you need to do what? You need to filter the water. Now, if you've got a carp in there, water can get pretty yucky because they're air breathers. But most fish, you need to flush that out. You have a series of filters. And there is usually a pump of some type in through there. So our big job when we're on the surface of the body is to move either the top anchor, that's the one that's easiest to move, so that the end opens up just a little bit, because these have got little flaps on them. All right? And then it'll close.
Used to teach this with whoopee cushions.
I couldn't find the whoopee cushion.
Well, but you can visualize the whoopee cushion. Everybody visualize a whoopee cushion. Try to open that flap.
All right, got it? That's my intent.
Question?
Oh,
Right.
oh, okay. So I'm just wondering, people donate plasma and stuff quite
Mhm.
frequently, especially now because of COVID. Would a regular plasma donor would that have a negative effect if you gave them a lymphatic drain, or would it not affect it at all?
Sometimes they'll change the pressure in there.
Right.
Now they just pull blood. They can't just pull plasma.
Okay.
They have to get the rest of the stuff that's floating around in and out of there. But that's why if you go donate blood or something, then they want you to hydrate a little bit to bring the blood volume up, just the fluid volume up just a little bit. Okay, do you remember what we did to assess for connective tissue? We hold down one side and then we come to bind. That's where we would stop with lymphatic drain, because that bind we are creating opens the flap. And then there's less pressure in the tube, in this fishbowl, in the surrounding water, and it flows in. And then when we release the pressure on it, the flap closes. So now we have a pump. Open the flap, close the flap. Open the flap, close the flap.
Light and delicate.
And the speed is important, because you gotta have enough time for the pressure gradient to equalize. And then you gotta close it back off again, so that now, because there's little, what they're called lymph angions, they're little tiny cells that squeeze in there, so they'll start pushing that fluid along. Now, it's not quite as basic as this, and when you read your anatomy, you'll see that that it's not just one little flap. The terminal collector in there has got like a series of little flaps on it and all that, but this is the principle. So when I am doing lymphatic work, I'm thinking pumps and flaps. So, and I don't worry too much about direction. But if I wanted to be specific, that fluid is trying to get back to the heart, right? So probably I'm going to think about how a squeegee functions. So if I've got a water spill and there's a drain in the floor, where do I start squeegeeing? Do I start squeegeeing at the outside wall, or do I squeegee close to the drain? What happens if you...
You just have to push it back into what you just cleaned.
Right, so typically you'd start, because it's usually on a downhill, if you know how construction is, so you start squeegeeing by the drain. You gotta open the drain, make sure the drain's not closed. So then you squeegee it. What happens then? The water that's out rolls towards you, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So there is some direction around that, and when we get to the application on the body, these are all factors. We say, okay, we're going to target lymphatics. You know, I'm going to move the body, I'm going to have a pump, I'm going to think about the direction this stuff is supposed to flow, all of that. When I am doing my initial connective tissue slide to see if the tissue in that particular area is moving, I take it from ease to bind, ease to bind. I'm doing the lymphatic move. That's why I teach these together. It's the same tissue layer, it's the same translation of tissue. It's just with the lymphatic part, I'm thinking fluid now. So, and I'm going to show you some ways to be efficient with that. So it's take it to bind, seeping in, take it back, take it to bind. You killed it.
I did.
It's really leaking now. And back. Connective tissue approaches and lymphatic approaches are slow. But when you think about lymphatic, if that is your intention, you're thinking, you can't push a river. The stuff moves fairly slow. There's no real current in here. You spend a lot of time to bind and let it come back. To bind. Now I changed my body mechanics, watch. To bind and back. To bind and you gotta have your face just right. Okay.
Sandy, you're the Bob Ross of
And those tubes, I visualize all those little tubes in there, and I think, well, maybe if I twist it a little bit that way, change the angle a little bit, that might get a different opening, Now, what do you think's the hard part in this?
Being slow.
Being slow. Where do you think you're gonna hang up on it? We're gonna give you one of these. It's being patient. And not over, these are little, these moves are little. There's a lot of hold and let go. So you don't want to try to rush this. And most people that are seeking massage are not satisfied with this as your primary approach, because it doesn't stimulate the different pressure receptors and mechanoreceptors. And after a while, it can actually get irritating to have it done. Compression devices, Normatec is one, but there are others where they rhythmically, they squeeze. They've got little cylinders in there, and it starts to squeeze at the top, and then the next cylinder squeezes, and next cylinder squeezes. Those do a way better job on the limbs. And then once it gets into the abdomen, then we just need to press. We need to do a rhythmic pressure there on the abdomen. And then the process I use is primarily from the osteopathic concept, but I also feed in some of this Vodder and some of the other originators. I don't know who originates anything, but I feed some of that in. The skill is to not get impatient and to learn how to hold one end down. So here, this is an ARG ball, and it's got some sort of a viscous material in it. Then the ground matrix, or the kind of gelatin part of fascia, has got that same kind of viscous, pliable type, colloid type material in it. But when I'm doing lymphatic drain, I want only to move the top. Okay, gotta get my face just right.
Can I get another angle?
As soon as I feel it here, I'm done. Are you asleep yet? I'm bored, so now I'm going to change my angle because I'm bored. Now, if while I am doing this as part of my general cleanup, and I go, that didn't move as much as that, because I'm working at bind anyway, then I'll go, well, since I'm here, I'll go through bind a little bit. Now the shape of the ball changes. Let's give them all a ball.